You slept last night. You ate this morning. You had the coffee. You did what you were supposed to do. And yet, somewhere around the middle of the day, something shifted. A heaviness settled in. Sentences became harder to finish. Decisions felt further away than they should. Most of us assume we understand why. We're tired because we didn't sleep enough, or worked too hard, or stressed too much. But the actual biology of fatigue is stranger and more layered than that simple explanation. There are at least 3 distinct systems driving the feeling of exhaustion. Tiredness is one of the most universal human experiences. We talk about it constantly. We joke about it. We spend enormous amounts of money trying to manage it. A 2016 report from the Rand Corporation estimated that sleep deprivation costs the United Kingdom alone over £40 billion a year in lost productivity. In the United States, that figure was estimated at over $400 billion. These are staggering numbers for something we tend to treat as a personal inconvenience. And yet, for all the attention we pay to it, most of us have only a rough idea of what tiredness actually is at a biological level. We tend to think of fatigue as a deficit, like a phone battery dropping towards zero, but that framing turns out to be incomplete. Tiredness is not simply an absence. It is an active signal, a process that is doing something to you, with a specific mechanism and a biological purpose. To understand it, we need to start with a molecule. Right now, as you're listening, a molecule is accumulating inside your brain. It has been building since the moment you woke up this morning. The longer you stay awake, the more of it collects, drifting into the spaces between your neurons and settling into receptors designed to receive it. That molecule is called adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of cellular activity. Every time your neurons fire, every time you think, perceive, or remember, your cells burn energy. Burning energy produces adenosine as metabolic waste. Think of it like exhaust from an engine. The harder you run, the more you generate. But your brain doesn't simply clear adenosine away. Your brain is reading it. The accumulation of adenosine functions as a running record of how long you've been awake and how hard your brain has been working. As adenosine builds, it progressively suppresses neural activity. It quiets the circuits associated with alertness. It reduces motivation and narrows attention. It turns down the volume, gradually, on your engagement with the world. Scientists call this sleep pressure, or process S, and it is one of 2 master systems that govern when and why you feel tired. By the time you've been awake for 16 hours, adenosine has reached levels that make sustained cognitive work genuinely harder. Reaction times slow. Emotional regulation weakens. Complex reasoning becomes more effortful. The afternoon slump is real, and it has a molecular explanation. But adenosine alone doesn't account for everything. If it did, we would feel steadily worse from the moment we woke, with no variation until we finally slept. There are some moments when a wave of tiredness passes, when a degree of alertness returns, seemingly without reason. So what is the second system? Deep inside your hypothalamus, a region at the base of your brain roughly the size of an almond, there is a small cluster of approximately 20,000 neurons. These neurons are called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN for short. What they do is keep time. Not as a metaphor. These neurons contain molecular clockwork, feedback loops of interacting proteins that switch genes on and off in a cycle lasting almost exactly 24 hours. This is your circadian clock. It runs continuously throughout your life, from birth onward, largely independent of your conscious control. This is process C, and it operates in direct counterpoint to adenosine's rising pressure. Throughout the day, your circadian clock drives the release of neurochemicals, including a signaling protein called produced in a nearby region of the hypothalamus that actively promotes senses of wake. This signal pushes back against the growing fog of adenosine, maintaining your capacity to function. That is why many people feel a degree of renewed alertness in the early evening, even after a demanding day. But then, typically somewhere between 9 and 11 at night for most adults, the circadian clock begins to withdraw that alerting signal. As it does, adenosine's accumulated pressure, no longer opposed, becomes overwhelming. That is when genuine sleepiness arrives. The transition into sleep is not a passive state. It is an active, coordinated biological process, and it is, when left undisturbed, one of the most reliable systems in human biology. In 1964, a 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner stayed awake for 11 days and 24 minutes. His experience was documented by Dr. William Dement of Stanford University, who monitored him during the final days of the attempt. By day 4, Gardner was having visual hallucinations. By day 6, he had developed involuntary tremors. By day 10, his short-term memory had deteriorated to the point where he struggled to maintain a train of thought. When he finally slept, he remained asleep for nearly 15 hours. During sleep, and specifically during its deeper stages, your brain activates a system that was only formally described relatively recently. It is called the glymphatic system, named for the glial cells that drive it. During deep sleep, the fluid-filled spaces between brain cells expand significantly. This allows cerebrospinal fluid to flow through brain tissue at a much higher rate than during wakefulness, carrying metabolic waste products out with it. Among the substances cleared during this process is adenosine, which is part of why sleep resolves the tiredness that waking builds. But also cleared is a protein called amyloid beta. This protein, when it accumulates over time in abnormal deposits, is strongly associated with Alzheimer's disease. Research published in PNAS in 2019 by Chokri and colleagues found that even a single night of poor sleep was associated with a measurable increase in amyloid beta accumulation in specific regions of the human brain. This finding sits within a broader and still developing body of research. The precise relationship between sleep disruption and long-term neurodegenerative risk remains an active area of investigation, but the direction of the evidence is consistent enough that many researchers now regard sleep not as one component of health among many, but as a fundamental maintenance process that the brain requires to function safely over time. Now, here is something that most conversations about fatigue leave out. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed that muscular fatigue during physical effort was caused primarily by lactic acid buildup in muscle tissue. It appeared in textbooks. It was taught as established fact. It turned out to be considerably more complicated than that. Research from the early 2000s onwards, including influential work by exercise physiologist Timothy Noakes at the University of Cape Town, challenged this model substantially. Muscles, Noakes and others argued, rarely approach actual structural failure during exercise. They typically retain significant reserve capacity, well beyond the point at which people stop. The signal to stop, that overwhelming sensation of not being able to continue, does not appear to originate purely in the muscle fiber itself. It appears to originate substantially in the brain. Knox proposed what he called the central governor model. The basic idea is that the brain continuously monitors the body's physiological state, tracking fuel reserves, oxygen levels, core temperature, and other variables. When the brain projects that you are approaching a threshold that could cause genuine harm, it generates the sensation of exhaustion as a protective signal, a mechanism to slow you down before actual damage occurs. The key word in that sentence is projects. The threshold may be predicted rather than current, which means the sensation of being unable to continue can precede the actual physiological limit. It is worth noting that the central governor model remains a subject of scientific debate. Not all researchers accept it in its original form, and the full picture of how peripheral and central fatigue interact is still being worked out. What this suggests is that fatigue, even physical fatigue, is not a straightforward readout of your body's mechanical state. It is, in part, a calculated signal from your nervous system. Elite athletes encounter this constantly. The decision to continue is, in part, a negotiation between a protective signal, urging cessation, and a conscious assessment of whether that signal is warranted. But there is another form of exhaustion that doesn't fit cleanly into adenosine, or circadian rhythms, or physical effort. It is the tiredness that follows not excessive activity, but sustained emotional or cognitive demand. The depletion that arrives after months of managing anxiety or grief, or the invisible weight of a life that requires more from you than you have to give. A 2022 study, published in Current Biology, led by researchers at the Paris Brain Institute, offered direct neurochemical evidence for one mechanism behind cognitive fatigue. The study used magnetic resonance spectroscopy to measure neurochemical changes in participants performing sustained cognitive tasks throughout the day. What the researchers found was that Glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, accumulated in the lateral prefrontal cortex over the course of a demanding day. The prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain most involved in executive function, planning, decision-making, regulating emotional responses, and managing complex social interactions. As glutamate accumulates there, the brain appears to respond by steering behavior away from activities that heavily recruit that region. This is why they draw toward low-effort activity in the evenings. Scrolling, passive entertainment, or simply staring at nothing is not straightforwardly a failure of discipline. It reflects a real shift in the brain's neurochemical state. The relevant regions are signaling that they have done enough for the day, and when the exhaustion is emotional in origin, the prefrontal cortex is managing something even more demanding than analytical tasks. It is moderating responses from the amygdala, the brain's threat response system. It is tracking the emotional states of others. It is doing the continuous, largely invisible work of self-regulation. That kind of fatigue can run deeper than a single night of sleep can repair. We began with what looked like a straightforward question. Why do you feel tired? But underneath that question is a more interesting one. Why does tiredness feel the way it does? Why does it carry that particular quality of heaviness, of distance, of things being slightly harder to reach? Why does exhaustion affect not just your capacity to function, but the texture of your experience? The answer seems to lie in something fundamental about how conscious experience works. Your sense of being a coherent, continuous person with preferences and intentions and an ongoing inner life is not a fixed background condition. It is an active construction, something your brain assembles continuously, drawing on significant metabolic resources moment to moment throughout the day. When those resources are depleted, when adenosine is high, when the prefrontal cortex is saturated with glutamate, when the circadian clock is signaling it is time to stop, this construction becomes less precise. The integration of incoming information slows. The brain's ability to model likely futures and plan accordingly becomes coarser. The detailed resolution of your moment-to-moment experience drops. This is why decisions feel harder when you're tired, not because your underlying intelligence has declined, but because the cognitive infrastructure that supports complex reasoning is running on reduced capacity. It is also why other people can feel more difficult to be around when you're exhausted. Emotional regulation and social attunement are metabolically expensive processes. When the prefrontal cortex is depleted, it no longer buffers minor social friction as invisibly as it does when you're well rested. Tiredness, at its more severe end, is partly a withdrawal from the full resolution of social and perceptual experience. No major physiological system in the body appears to function optimally without adequate sleep. Immune function, hormonal regulation, memory consolidation, emotional processing, cardiovascular health, and yet, for most of the past century, many of the cultures with the most sophisticated understanding of these mechanisms have also been the most systematic about overriding them. The valuation of minimal sleep as a mark of productivity or resilience is almost certainly the reverse of what the evidence supports. Research by Williamson and Fayer 2000 found that 17 hours of sustained wakefulness produced performance impairments comparable to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. 24 hours brought impairments comparable to 0.10%. We would not regard impaired judgment from alcohol as a productivity asset. The evidence suggests we should be equally skeptical of the same impairment from insufficient sleep. There is a hypothesis, still being developed and debated, that sleep may represent the metabolic cost of sustaining conscious awareness. The brain, while awake and actively modeling reality in real time, generates a metabolic burden that cannot be sustained without periodic recovery. In this framing, the need for sleep is not a design flaw. It is not a vulnerability. It is a necessary feature of having a brain complex enough to produce experience in the first place, which means the next time exhaustion settles over you in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, there is a different way to understand it. Not as a failure of effort or discipline, but as an honest signal from a system that has been running continuously since you woke up, a system that, with considerable sophistication, is telling you something accurate about your current state. Being alive at the level of complexity that conscious humans are, it turns out, is genuinely costly. Even the most capable biological system we know of needs eventually, to rest.